Welcome to TOL Talk. I'm Andy Markowitz. In this edition, a conversation with the esteemed documentary filmmaker and chronicler of the communist world, Leslie Woodhead. As a young researcher for Britain's Granada TV, Leslie Woodhead shot the first footage of the Beatles, performing in 1962 at Liverpool's Cavern Club. He went on to make films about artists ranging from the Rolling Stones to Randy Newman to Tony Bennett. But his major focus as a filmmaker has been the communist and post-communist world, first in an acclaimed series of dramatized documentaries in the 1970s and 80s that recreated contemporary historical events, like the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the birth of the Solidarity movement, most recently with a string of non-fiction films made in and about the former Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. His 2009 BBC documentary, How the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin, brought together these twin poles of Woodhead's career, revealing the story of Soviet Beatlemania and how it undermined communist rule. He's now at work on a book of the same name, exploring the larger history of Western popular culture in the Soviet bloc. In this interview, originally conducted for the music documentary hub site musicfilmweb.com, I talked to Leslie Woodhead about the Beatles, the Kremlin, and rock and roll back in the USSR. You've made more than 40 feature documentaries, not even counting a lot of your early television work, covering subjects from musical, political, anthropological, cross-cultural worlds. This one really seems to bring all of those together.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, certainly for me, doing the film was a kind of labor of love. I had discovered over a period of years of making documentaries in the former Soviet Union that the Beatles had a much larger presence there than anything I'd ever imagined. So over the years, I've gradually got to know people who told me about that and excavated it more deeply. And it does, as you say, cover every kind of territory: musical, anthropological, social history, comedy even. It's such a bizarre story.
How did you begin developing these relationships where people talk to you about this?
It was kind of by accident, and along the way, and I stumbled into the edges of it while I was working on quite different things. I guess the single most important point of contact was a guy called Artemy Troitsky, who is Russia's most kind of celebrated rock guru, writer, broadcaster, promoter, enabler of the whole Russian rock scene since the 1970s. Artemy became my friend and guide and patron and protector now over a period of more than 20 years. I first met him back in the late 80s in London, where he was coming to the West for the first time to promote a book that he'd written about Soviet rock and roll called Back in the USSR, inevitably. He's a remarkable guy, immensely charismatic, very smart, very kind of original, with a huge range of very surprising and unexpected views, but also tremendously enabling, and I count him now one of my friends. Actually, I really do, because we go back a long way now. I was working at the time, or beginning to look at, a film which in fact bumped into Soviet rock and roll. It was a film about an extraordinary American called Dean Reed, who from the 60s onwards became the official rock star for the Soviet Union. He was a true believer. He'd been bitten by the socialist bug when he was a nothing in particular pop singer in South America. He's actually from Denver, Colorado. But Dean's great virtues was that he was an extremely handsome guy, very charismatic, very attractive,
right,
very charming.
Kind of a Ricky Nelson. I've seen films about him as well. Not quite as talented as Ricky.
No. At a moment when the Komsomol, the Soviet youth organization, was looking for an antidote to the Beatles, Dean was it. They picked him up, as I say, at a youth conference in South America. They transported him back to Moscow, and they turned him into Comrade Rockstar, the guy who, as far as they could see, was a real rock and roll singer, but importantly, he also spouted the party line. So he had everything as far as the Kremlin was concerned at that time. Weirdly, Dean Reed used to sing extremely awful versions of Beatles hits as part of his concerts alongside his self-penned spent quite a while pursuing the extraordinary story of Dean Reed, and Art was one of my main guides in pursuing that story. And over that period, he also talked to me about the real thing, about the Beatles, which initially I had trouble kind of even believing the scale of what Art said about the Beatles. I literally didn't know that the Fab Four, who of course were never allowed to play in the former Soviet Union, had become such a formative influence in the lives of hundreds and hundreds of millions of young communists.
And so did he kind of introduce you into other worlds, or did this just put the bug in your head?
Art did exactly that. He took me to meet people, Soviet rock stars. By this time, when we were first doing this, it was in the late 80s, so the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union. We were still back in the USSR, but he took me to meet various big rock stars of the time, who are still big rock stars in the Soviet Union. A man called Andrei Makarevich, who is the head of a band called Time Machine, who were the first really big rock band singing in Russian from the 70s onwards, and another possibly even bigger star called Boris Grebenshchikov, the absolute masthead of Soviet rock.
Right, the first one also tried to make it in the West.
Yeah, and indeed did an album with CBS Records,
right,
and was the subject of a documentary made by Michael Apted.
Yeah, very good film called The Long Way Home.
Yeah, Michael is a long-standing TV friend of mine. So in the midst of all of this tangle of Dean reading, I was also doing films about the Soviet space program with a particular spin on the music that spilled out of the Soviet space program, which again took me into the popular music of the period from the 60s to the 90s, which again sometimes bumped into the Beatles, and a bunch of other films that I was doing over there, all of which from time to time seemed to collide with the Beatles. One of my other key informants was a Russian-American journalist who you may in fact have encountered, a guy called Vladimir Posner, who used to turn up on Nightline in the States, doing, explaining Gorbachev's policies to people in the States.
No, he was really fascinating figure to the West. I mean, I remember when I was a young man and all of this was going on, this guy who spoke flawless English, who didn't sound foreign at all, was suddenly showing up as the mouthpiece of the Soviet Union, I think.
He's a hypnotic guy who has also become a friend. In fact, I made a whole film about Vladimir. And he doesn't sound Russian, because he isn't Russian. He grew up in New York City.
Okay.
And his father was a Russian who in 1950, well, in the late 40s, he got thrown out of New York because he refused to renounce his citizenship, and he dragged the young Posner off to Moscow, where he got stuck behind the Iron Curtain for the next 38 years.
Right.
But he was he's a wonderful mediator for me, because he absolutely understands both worlds. And he was a wonderful mediator in telling me how the cultural Gauleiters in the Kremlin looked at the problems of rock and roll, and specifically at the Beatles.
How did they? I mean, you go into your film over the course of years, of course, eventually the Soviet authorities kind of adopted a "if you can't beat them, join them" mentality. They first tried to throw Dean Reed at the youth, and then started printing their own records illegally, selling Beatles records through the official state record company, and then finally kind of opened the doors and allowed a Soviet rock culture to happen in certain ways. Now, people like Boris Grebenshchikov were banned from performing for many years until the Glasnost period, but there was a development of a sort of a Russian rock star and rock band
world. That's right. Well, of course, Boris and indeed Makarevich with Time Machine were strictly underground for years and years and years, and were constantly hassled and harassed and all that went with that. I mean, the story of all of this, the subtext of my interest in all of this is the despairing, hopeless, ineffectual efforts of the cultural supervisors in the former Soviet Union to try and corral and discipline first jazz and then rock music in their country, and to try and come up with something else that they were happier with. They, of course, failed absolutely dismally because that something else was never in any way of interest to their own people. So that long guerrilla war between the cultural controllers and the kids and the people is one of the subtexts that I'm writing about now in my book, and it's an extraordinary story, absolutely extraordinary, because particularly under Stalin, it went through endless shifts and changes of emphasis, which one year they'd be embracing Western music and inviting Benny Goodman to come to the Soviet Union, and then the next year they'd be sending jazz musicians to the gulags. It's a bizarre story of constant switches of policy, and the Beatles were just one of the later manifestations of this puzzlement.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's certainly a view, I think, in the West of this kind of gray, unchanging obstacle, this block in Soviet culture and in the larger Eastern communist culture that was like a wall stopping all Western culture from getting in. But it wasn't. There was this history of back and forth, just like there were in things like Stalinist foreign policy that first was with the Germans, then with the Allies. It was very, opportunistic in many ways.
That's absolutely right. And in many ways, of course, this musical backwards and forwards very much echoed foreign policy. What's fascinated me as I've got increasingly involved with looking at this for my book particularly is how far back these issues played out. I mean, the first American jazz bands were playing in the Soviet Union by 1926 and were initially welcomed because the music was felt to be proletarian in origin and therefore acceptable. It was only when Stalin began to shut the door on the outside world, from the early 30s particularly, that this became unacceptable, and the long ping pong between acceptance and rejection cut in. The Beatles were a particular problem. I think that the regimes just really couldn't get their minds around it. It just seemed to them nothing but a meaningless noise. There's another point, actually, I think, about the Beatles, which Posner was very helpful in pointing out. He said, you must understand that these old guys in the Kremlin couldn't stand being laughed at. That they couldn't deal with. And they kind of had an intuition that the Beatles were caustic and skeptical and would make fun of them. That they found particularly difficult to contemplate, and that was another reason why they were shut out. Most important, of course, they understood that the Beatles represented a massive challenge to a repressive state. They embodied and exemplified the possibility of liberation, of freedom, of living your own life, your own way. It wasn't the lyrics. Russian kids couldn't understand the Beatles' lyrics anyway. It was the feel and the style of the music and the feel and the style of the Beatles themselves that conveyed this seditious message.
There's an interesting question that's not directly addressed in the film, but I think is sort of an inevitable idea that bubbles into the mind of Westerners who watch it, and that's the different ways in which the Beatles, and maybe to a larger extent rock and roll, grew and became cultural forces in the West versus the East. I mean, what happened, in a very reductive way, what happened in the Soviet Union in the 60s was the emergence of a teenage culture and a youth culture fed by and maybe led by the Beatles, slipping through the cracks, that mirrored what happened in the previous 10 or 20 years in the U.S. and Britain.
That's correct. What's actually striking is how, in a suppressed way, the Soviet kids had the same yearnings and expectations of that music. They had an extra. I mean, Troitsky made me understand that in a way, unlike the West, the fact that they were illicit, they were not allowed, they were banned, they were prohibited, gave them even more juice for that generation over there. I actually suspect that if the old guys in the Kremlin had had the wisdom to just let it go, it would have been a lot less tempting than it turned out to be.
Right, and the attempt to enforce an alternative youth culture that, as you can see in the film, and as many of your interviewees say, is it's laughable to us now watching archive footage of it. This just socialist, realist version of teenage culture that it's hard to believe anyone thought would have any commerce with its intended audience.
That's exactly right. I mean, it is, as you say, comic looking at the archive film of these stiff, badly dressed, uncomfortable-looking Soviet teenagers being drilled into performing dances that were specially devised by the Central Committee cultural people to be acceptable for Soviet kids. I'm just reading a quote of Troitsky's right now, which I'm working on in my book, which is kind of relevant to this. He says, "They prepared Soviet kids for a different lifestyle, different ideologies, different human values. The Beatles never articulated any of this, of course, but the music itself was crucial. The message we took was that we're free even though we live behind the Iron Curtain. You can pretend to be a young communist, but at the same time, you're someone totally different. You're a stranger in your own country." I think that's an amazing quote, actually, and takes you right to the heart of all of this. That, of course, in seeking to prohibit Western rock and roll, and the Beatles specifically, the rulers of the Kremlin actually propelled the changes they were desperate to avoid. They created a huge dissonance in their population between the authoritarian view and the life that people were actually living.
Well, there's a reference in your film as your movie moves into the glasnost era. There's a reference to Gorbachev as the first rock and roll president of the Soviet Union, and I don't think he was a rock and roller. In particular, I don't know a great deal about Gorbachev's musical taste. I think he was still of a bit of an older generation, but he certainly behaved more like a human being, or what we perceive to be a human being, than someone like Brezhnev is. He seemed to be the first Soviet leader who actually was of his time and existed in a world where rock and roll also existed.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I somewhat doubt that Gorbachev ever expected. First of all, he was a committed and true believing communist leader.
Right.
It was not his intent to dismantle communism in the Soviet Union, but there's a Polish political scientist who wonderfully described the impossibility of mixing freedom with socialism. He said it's like trying to fry snowballs. The minute you start doing that, as Gorbachev discovered, everything comes down on your head. If you combine this with the fact that by that time, by 85, when Gorbachev became leader, the entire system was broken. The economy was screwed. Everything was dysfunctional. The industrial base was wrecked. I mean, there was nothing to work with by that time. So a whole range of things were obviously playing into that situation. But the sense that millions of Soviet kids had defected from the notion of building socialism, had just given up on it years before, obviously corroded the foundations of the belief system in the most fundamental way.
What do you think that it took the Beatles for that to happen? The Beatles didn't create youth culture, so to speak, in the West. Teenage culture sort of in the West goes back to, Frank Sinatra, and then Elvis took it to another level, and the Beatles took it to another. But based on your film, at least, it would seem like, again, there was this sort of black hole until the Beatles came along. Why do you think it was them and not their predecessors who started that ball rolling?
The first, evidence of what we would know as rock and roll in the former Soviet Union turned up. There was a huge international youth congress, a youth festival in Moscow in 1957, which Khrushchev enabled as part of his, de-Stalinization. He invited 30,000 kids to come to Moscow, and they came from all over the world, particularly from the United States. And they brought with them the beginnings of rock and roll. They brought Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley. But as Troitsky is very good in describing how the more raucous version of particularly American rock and roll, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, that kind of music, is just, as he puts it, too overdriven for Soviet taste. It lacks melody. They love and need melody. They are far nearer the poetic end of the spectrum where that's concerned. And of course the Beatles just delivered beautiful melody and that liberated style, which were just irresistible to the audience that needed, as Troitsky puts it, these vitamins. We needed these vitamins in our system because we weren't getting them from anywhere. And he said that the rock and roll of Elvis, Little Richard, and the James Brown was just too excessive for Soviet taste. That's just the way it was.
It was too excessive for a lot of Western tastes too. I mean, they terrified a lot of people in the West, but more for reasons, I guess, of race and sex and things like that.
Well, I think race has got a lot to do with it. I mean, obviously, the difficulties of dealing with the raucous black rock and roll performers can only be imagined in a country that was as unfamiliar with and as likely to be racist as communist Soviet Union was.
One of the things that your movie really makes clear in ways that, again, are both sort of dramatic and tragicomic is the lengths to which this newly baptized Beatles generation in the Soviet Union went to make this part of their lives, because it was still banned. You couldn't get these records, and there's a great deal in the film about people recording their own albums on whatever pieces of vinyl they could get their hands on, of making their own guitars and their pickups, because you simply couldn't get these things. That's
right. I mean, the extraordinary improvisatory energy of that generation of kids is boundless. Actually, I mean, time and time again, I heard these stories of how people used, first of all, X-ray plates of Uncle Sergei's lungs to inscribe, "I feel fine" on them or something like that, through street-side recording booths, which had been set up actually for soldiers away from home to record sentimental messages for their old mothers. But they worked out a way of taking, broadcasts from Radio Luxembourg or from Voice of America or BBC World Service, and tape recording them on the earliest reel-to-reels, and then inscribing them on these X-ray plates. I think actually the most influential of these things, because the X-ray plates, which were terrible quality, were probably not significant by the early 60s, but the reel-to-reel tape recorders were absolutely decisive, because they were quite good quality, and you could swap that stuff. You could exchange your tape recordings with your friends across the Soviet Union. And the system doesn't ever seem to have got a hold of that. It's bizarre that in a system that tightly controlled even typewriter ribbons and teletext and phones, they didn't really grasp the seditious power of tape recorders.
Well, it makes me wonder again if another element of the timing of this, was that technology provided ways that hadn't existed even a few years before for this for it to spread virally like that, for people to.
I think that's true, and of course the old guys in the Kremlin weren't exactly the most streetwise technologists. I mean, they were looking at other things. It becomes extraordinarily difficult, even for the most repressive regimes, to quite extinguish information and cultural information, particularly. I mean, even the Chinese have struggled with shutting down, the internet. Even the Iranians have struggled with that.
Well, that's an interesting, almost test case of what you said earlier, the idea that you can't have a communist society or a rigidly controlled society side by side with a society with relative freedom of information. And, so far the Chinese seem to be doing a much better job of that, better being a relative term from the perspective of what the government there wants to do, than the Russians did. It's like this sort of great experiment in trying to create a society that's politically closed but economically and in many ways culturally open. I mean, rock and roll is not banned in China.
Yeah, it's a very, very hard act to bring off that. Of course, the Chinese have had the benefit of having, until comparatively recently, a less, urbanized and industrialized society. Mm-hmm. But also, they have always had, or traditionally had, a far more obedient society. Obedience was not was kind of blown in the Soviet Union, I guess, by 1950. There are habits of obedience in Chinese culture which are quite unlike the ones in the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say. I mean, the obedience. It gets back, I think, to this issue of emotional defection. I mean, most people were were publicly obedient to the regime. Yes. They really had no choice.
Yes,
if they wanted to maintain some kind of life and raise a family and not be imprisoned. But in their heads, they were living, and in their homes, in their private homes, they were living a different life.
That's interesting. I'm sure that is correct, I think, and I'm not struck as you say that with. I did a film a while back about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and the heart of this was a guy who had drafted the program for the Prague Spring for Dubček, and who actually was at party school with a young communist called Mikhail Gorbachev. But he said, the decisive thing there was that certainly in '68, when Dubček was going flat out for his reform program, what really was vital was that for the first time in decades, public and private life were aligned. People were the same in the street as they were at home. They were the same on the street as they were at their workplace. That was an extraordinarily exhilarating moment. It didn't last very long because Dubček obviously was kicked out and the ghouls were put back in control.
What brought you to the Soviet Union as a filmmaker in the late 80s? I mean, I know throughout the several years before that you had been doing films about what had been going on in the 50s and 60s and 70s behind the Iron Curtain. You made a series of dramatized documentaries, sort of the early docudramas, based on actual transcripts, based on what really happened, but obviously with actors and situations like that. So this was obviously something you were interested in. What actually brought you there, and under what circumstances did you start filming?
I should backtrack a little bit. I had a very strange... I had of the generation, more or less the last generation in the UK that had to do compulsory military service, 2 years of military service. And although I didn't feel it at the time, I now realize I got seriously lucky because I got scooped up to be one of 5,000 young men in the late 50s who were taught Russian by the services, but in my case by the Royal Air Force. And, it was fairly speedy and pretty limited to military stuff. But nevertheless, I was taught Russian, shipped out to Berlin before the wall was built, and spent nearly a year listening in on Soviet pilots flying in and out of East Berlin. So that fueled up my interest in that part of the world. I wasn't able to go there at all, to the Soviet Union, until Gorbachev came to power, particularly as I had this kind of low-level espionage background. It didn't seem like a terribly good idea to put my head in that vice, nor, I think, would I have got a visa. And indeed, when I started going in for the first time in 1986, I did wonder if any of this would show up and give me an uncomfortable time at the port of entry in Moscow, but it never did. The first thing that took me to film in that part of the world, in fact, was the Dean Reed film, which was kind of a wonderful story for me. It lay exactly at the intersection of two of my interests: popular music and Soviet culture.
Russia of today, while not what it was in Soviet times, has reverted somewhat. It's an authoritarian society in many ways. There's this, I guess, complete cultural freedom. No one is going to tell you at all what you can listen to But
it's politically pretty shut down. Well,
yeah.
as you know, I mean, one of the most dangerous things to be in Russia today is a journalist. So you're right. I mean, socially things have opened up, especially in the big cities, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. You could feel that this is a normal life in a way you would never have felt it as recently as the 1980s.
Well, in your film, there's this sort of a very, in the Beatles film, speaking of her, there's a glow to it, and it's a very warm film. It's the sense that people have of what the Beatles have done in their lives is very anecdotal, and it's felt. Did you feel that there wasn't a place to sort of go into what's happened since then?
It wasn't the kind of film I wanted to make, actually. I mean, I did want to catch the sense that my friends and the people I got to know were giving me of the transformative impact of these kids of the Beatles on their lives, and how they were, they shone a light in a pretty dark place. No, I was not. I was less interested in a kind of academic deconstruction of how those things played out. Perhaps I'm trying to do more of that in the book I'm currently writing.
It's a little difficult not to feel the irony of watching Sergei Ivanov, who was Putin's defense minister, who seems delightful in the clips you show of him, and is, I'm sure, is a lovely man, but sort of just grinning helplessly as he talks about this, but at the same time, kind of being aware that he's in some ways part of the problem now and not so much part of the solution.
Well, he's one of the authors of the Chechen War. Don't forget it. He has a lovely smile and a lilting English ability, but he's a tough cookie. And in fact, if he hadn't lost out in the last lap to Medvedev, he would have been the guy. I mean, that was a close-run thing between the two of them. I'll never forget when we did that interview with Sergei Ivanov in the Russian White House. He was about 5 minutes late, and he came skidding into the room, and he said, "You must excuse me. I was in a meeting with Vladimir Vladimirovich." And I thought, Christ, what did he have to say to Putin to get out of the meeting? I'm just going off down the corridor to speak to the BBC about the Beatles.
They say Putin's a big ABBA fan, so maybe he could sympathize at least a little bit.
That's right. That's right.
In that regard. You're lucky if you were making an ABBA documentary, Putin would have probably come skittering down the hall.
I think no problem at all for ABBA, but I don't think he wasn't exactly a Fab fan, although McCartney said that he played Let It Be for him when he did his 2003 Red Square concert.
Does history record what Putin's response was?
He said something bland and approving.
Leslie Woodhead's book, How the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin, is due to be published in early 2013 by Bloomsbury, USA. You can learn more about his long and varied film and television career at www.lesliewoodhead.com. And there's plenty more coverage related to the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union on Transitions Online at www.tol.org. For TOL Talk, I'm Andy Markowitz. Thanks for listening.
Utrą się remęciewo, noczu było nie do sna. Siu do rogu piszą siedział mi wino, zna swój ruska jest znana, jest mowa BZZZ. Ja szczęśliw jak nikogda, znowa BZZZ. Jak się zdodawa wewnątrz jak nogawoj, zdjąć mnie lub podawno. Raz pakuję za fragment